I'm Dane Rose, and this is the map of sex that I never received as a child, adolescent, going into adulthood. And so it's a map that I've created to navigate what is one of the most complex, potentially pleasurable, potentially painful interactions that a human being can have. So this is my map, things that have come up along the way in my time with approximately 100 lovers, sometimes just a one-time experience, sometimes a 2 or 3 day rich cocoon, other times a open relationship, other times a monogamous relationship of different durations, and sometimes in a marriage, sometimes outside of a marriage. And so this is going to touch on, just graze the surface of these terrains as a springboard, because some of these areas you're going to know extremely well, and others are going to be a fresh perspective. And it's those areas that it behooves all of us, given the significance of the experience and its impact in our lives and in our culture, to explore. So let's first look at the dimensions of sex. So we have the physical dimension, which is obvious, fucking, in all of its various forms. We have the mental dimension of connecting ideas, and we have the emotional dimension, which varies based on the maturity of love, and we might as well add that as a piece here to discuss. But on an emotional level, the young loves are about need and attachment. And this replicates the fact that as you enter a romantic relationship, there's a certain way we're reliving childhood. So you have the emotional dimension. And you have the spiritual dimension, which we'll get to when we talk about transcendence. Now, next, and a good place for some of us to start, is pornography. So pornography is a powerful phenomena as a species, in part because it's tying into the primary procreation drive, which is a strong drive. It's tying in with addiction, which I'll just add into the trauma section so I don't forget it later on. And it also ties in with our unfettered sexual template, which we'll get into in a moment. But one of the best ways to think of pornography, particularly pornography that is explored in a terrain where you do not expect to be watched, is you will learn the dimensions and the areas where you have the strongest flow. Meaning anyone who's using pornography is gravitating towards stimulation and release. And that stimulation, that arousal and release, and the pleasure or distraction that comes from it, is going to be found in this next area, which is the sexual template. Now, we all have a sexual template, or an arousal template. And what we can learn from pornography is the direction of that arousal template. Just an example, if you find yourself attracted to pregnant women, as just one example in pornography, you may find that a lot of the energy that can be released within your sexual template has to do with the infant-child bond, meaning that something happened traumatically in the child-infant bond, or that something did not happen. So there is an emotional charge psychologically around that relationship. And so where you're going to gravitate, given that all sex is ultimately, as we get to the yin-yang balance, a dynamic of flow, the most intense, passionate, engaged, pleasurable flow, and even unpleasurable flow, because there's often the strongest flow is a mixture of positive and negative, expansive and contracting energy, is going to flow in the areas that you have the most high bandwidth. So if you try, this area of sexuality and very little flows along, it's like you're using an old style telephone connection to download the internet. It takes a very long time to get very little energy coming through that connection. So it's not going to engage you. But as you move through the different expressions of sexuality, there's going to be some areas where it's just like, it's so fast you can barely keep track of what's going on. And it's so intense. And that's an area where there is a very strong positive and or negative charge relating to a strong need, a strong area that hasn't happened. And in this area, you're going to experience a flow. It's very much like connecting to different batteries. And so if there's one battery that has a strong charge where nothing's been tapped off there, or if there's a bunch of batteries that have similar charge, but one, has a very, small gauge wire. Small gauge equals high flow in electrical terms. So if you have a 4-gauge wire, it's a giant wire. And so there's going to be a lot of electrical current flowing through that arena. And because the mother and father, the original and it's not always mother and father as the masculine and feminine. The primary masculine and the primary feminine person that you had a relationship with will determine the type of template. These are the pathways that you developed in your brain as an infant to relate to the primary masculine and the primary feminine presence in a homosexual, gay, whatever the names are these days, couple. It's going to be whoever was more of the nurturing, emotional provider, feminine, and more of the boundary, more of the challenger, masculine. And there's an entire segment on the distinctions that are not gender-based between masculine and feminine, but the Chinese have done a good job with yin and yang. If you just don't think about gender. If you take the time to deeply understand yang and yin, then you understand, for example, in any human interaction, the yang person is, for example, the speaker, the yin is the listener. The yang is the initiator, the feminine is the responder. So this can be played by a man or a woman and at different times, but the pattern of receiving and giving energy, the pattern of the masculine and the feminine is set with those original relationships, and it's set at a very high bandwidth, relatively unconsciously. And one of the things that's most blind in our culture is a discussion of the causes and the basis for the masculine-feminine template. Because here's where you get things such as reversed polarities, where when someone comes up to you and says, hey, how can I make you happy? You feel turned off. But if they say, go away, you're interested. Well, that's when those polarities get reversed at an early age. And so these deep template issues are one of the most important things to understand, particularly if you find yourself attracted to behavior that your mental mind is, alarmed by, but you're aroused by what you're alarmed by. And so this is all in the area of sexual template. Now, the sexual template determines, for example, your interest in BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism, dominance, submission, and there's probably a few other variants in there. But this is coming from the sexual template. If your primary way of receiving, for example, is to be hurt, that's how you've primarily experienced energy flowing in, you have to develop, as an infant, an internal area of your brain that can process that energy. And particularly when you have people that then call hurting you love, well, then, love me equals hurt me, and a whole variety of things. And you have these phenomena where when you're really attracted to someone, you will open up to your full unedited sexual template, which for many people, particularly women, is an invitation to violate, because the primary relationship with the masculine feminine energy within the culture is one of violation to the feminine. The yin energy in a Western culture is systematically violated by being given a low rank. So we move then into the yin-yang balance, meaning in this domain you'll have the strongest sexual flow when you have an equal mix of yin energy, receiving energy, for example, and giving energy, yang. Now, if you have 100 units ready to receive and 100 units ready to give, there's a very strong rapid flow. It's like a semi-truck backing up into a loading dock and efficiently being unloaded. Now, that's called strong, satisfying sex. Now, if you have the opposite of that experience, two people wanting to unload and no one there to receive, two trucks back up to unload, they both fling open the doors, and there's nowhere for the boxes to go. And if you can think of that mentally, emotionally, verbally, energetically, and physically, two penises banging into each other, two people talking at the same time, two people trying to lead, no one wanting to follow, two people wanting to have their own way, you don't get any flow. But the same is true in reverse. Two people wanting to listen, no one's talking, two empty trucks back up to one another, there's nothing to unload. You see, you get the strongest balance with a mixture of masculine and feminine energy. Now, what chauvinism is, this is a French fellow, Mr. Chauvin, who liked to think that half of the world is more valuable than the other. And particularly men were more important than women. And so chauvinism is the overvaluing of half of the universe, half of the population, the overvaluing of yang energy, and the undervaluing of yin, of feminine energy, of women. And so we are in a profoundly chauvinistic culture. And there are biological reasons for that. There are very strong cultural and historical reasons for that. But the bottom line is, in Western culture, you are ranked higher as a teacher than as a student. You are ranked higher as a speaker than as a listener. You are ranked higher as a leader than as a follower. You are ranked higher for your mental ideas than your emotions. You are ranked higher for your external qualities than your internal qualities, and thank goodness at least that one benefits women, because women, most men and women agree, have more beautiful bodies And so the obsession with the external there turns chauvinism in the female favor. But primarily, as a man and as a woman, you're going to lose social ranking to the degree you express feminine traits. You're going to gain social ranking to the degree you express masculine strength. And this correlates, economically into, I have both sides as a contractor relating to my clients. It's usually to the degree that I'm feminine, that my income goes down by about a third. It's to the degree that I am masculine that my income goes up. So I get to play it both ways. I also, of course, thankfully get to travel overseas to other cultures where my feminine is valued as much or more as my masculine. And so I get to be a radiant feminine presence and get valued and honored for that. Not so much in the United States, but thankfully in a few places overseas. Now, we next move into the phenomena of what does sex do into, what effect does it have into a relationship? And generally speaking, it will either accelerate and amplify whatever is there. It's an accelerant. Or if that's too much, it's a dissociative. So if you can imagine driving down the freeway at whatever speed, sex is flooring the gas. So whatever is going on, and of course, it will floor the gas physically, meaning whatever you're doing physically, it's probably not as exciting and dynamic as sex. Few things are as exciting and dynamic as sex. You get into things like marathon running and triathlons and things of that nature, but in many cases, if you run the full gamut of sexuality, sex will be more engaged. Now, so sex will stimulate the body for sure. Now, when we come into this area of integration, we're looking at, is your body dissociated from your heart, from your mind, or integrated? Now, if you are integrated, and that's the next kind of point on this map, you will accelerate your thoughts, your creativity will often blossom, your emotions will deepen, whatever they are. Meaning if you're a little bit envious of your partner showing interest in another person, you have sex, typically you'll be more envious. If you're a little bit in love, typically you'll be more in love if you're integrated. And so you've got the phenomena of acceleration of whatever is there. And so, some people, and particularly, for example, people in the sex trade, are very good at dissociating. I remember a lover that absolutely beautiful woman. We'd had the most interesting and engaging conversations, and I'd want to be a little bit closer to her. And, being a sex worker, she had zero qualms about me entering her. But as soon as I'd enter her, the feelings and the thoughts would shut off. And I'd be like, where did you go? And she didn't know. And she actually had this little ritual where I'd say, let's carry this conversation on inside of you. And she'd get up, go to the bathroom, and when she came back, she was a dissociated person. And so it didn't actually accelerate the thoughts and feelings, which was the main interest for me. And so I found I enjoyed talking with her as a mental, emotional woman and not being sexual more than I enjoyed having sex with an empty body. But we're dealing with acceleration of whatever is there. Now, acceleration often leads to dissociation, particularly in an emotionally illiterate culture. Meaning none of you have gone to school and learned the science of emotion with the same sophistication as we'd learned the Photoshop color wheel. But if there are 256 million colors created by a computer, there are infinite amounts of emotional states, and they're always shifting and moving. We have a very minimal vocabulary. We have very few tracking skills. We dissociate constantly. And so what sometimes happens is if you accelerate the emotions too quickly, you just go numb and dissociate because it's like, it's too much going on there for my limited processing power, the gifts of our culture, which has said that, well, you're basically going to come into this world illiterate when it comes to your emotions. And not to mention the confusion and the reversal and this, that, and the other. So the old adage, go a little bit slower if you want the relationship to last, it's often referring to, A, that the relationship is by no means likely, if you default to your template and default to your chauvinism, it's by no means likely that what's going on is good. So flooring the accelerator when you're pointed at a brick wall is by no means a good idea. And so, certainly that's the end of the relationship. You hit a wall a few times, and it's like, it's enough of that. And so there you're dealing with the acceleration aspect. The ideal time to accelerate is when you're pointed mutually in a great direction. That's when acceleration is it's the most amazing thing imaginable, because you get there faster and with more dimension. The worst time to accelerate is when you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where you're pointed in different directions, and you will just accelerate the violation and catastrophic ending. When you deal with the integration dimension, what we're looking at is how integrated are the thoughts, feelings, body, and culture. So we're looking at two things. How does the couple integrate or violate the culture? Because that has a big effect on sex. And it actually, when you look at statistics around sexual abuse, for example, an older man having sex with a 16-year-old girl, there are cultures where, and I'm going to add this bit on attunement on the map here, just because it's an important distinction. There are cultures where this can be a mutually beneficial phenomena, where the older person attunes to and steps down the energy, allowing the smaller mass, the less developed emotional body, the less developed mental body, the less developed physical body, to take the lead in an educational framework of protection and exploration, where the younger person will actually, when it is culturally sanctioned, come out faster and stronger into their individuality than if they are dealing with another 16-year-old who's clueless and has no idea what they're doing. However, we don't have those cultures. And one of the bits of data that's important to keep in mind with sexual abuse is that the secrecy and the shame usually does more damage than the violation or perceived violation. The secrecy, the shame, and the ostracization that comes with it, the loneliness and dissociation and trauma that comes with that in a culture that does not embrace or allow for what happened, usually does more damage than whatever it is that's happened. Because secrecy, violation, shame, and dissociation is always damaging. It's always damaging. And who does it damage most? Usually the youngest person, because it's the young person that needs to integrate it the most and needs to talk about it. And so, we have this arbitrary cutoff line of, it's 18 years old and that's it. But that is our culture. Now, because we've set that as our culture, it's very important not to, transgress that line, for the simple reason that it leaves the younger person independent of all the other circumstances, meaning it could have been in another culture beneficial for this and that reason in this and that case and da-da-da. You have to look at all the variables just like anything else. Is it good to eat avocado? Well, not when you're about to take a psychedelic or do something else. So it's all contextual. But the culture is a huge context. It is absolutely essential to move in the direction where everything that is participated, that is significant to the individual, can be embraced and talked about in the culture without shame and without exclusion. So, and in that, its attunement is always the issue. The stronger energy needs to attune to the smaller or less mass energy. For example, you have phenomena of threesomes or fivesomes. If the masculine is attuning to the feminine, whoever is in the feminine role, the receiving role, is opening. That vulnerability is part of the equation. So when the masculine takes the responsibility to attune to the feminine, think of it as eating, you've got a good dynamic. If someone's feeding you, it can be the most heavenly experience in the world. If they're stuffing your face faster than you can chew with the most delicious chocolate cake, you want to throw up. Because what we're dealing with is rhythm, attunement, respect, to look again, honoring, to be changed by what one sees. So we're dealing with, attunement is a key principle in how positive or negative the flow is, and whether, when you accelerate a lack of attunement, you create more violation, moving towards mental, emotional, physical violence. Now, so integration, we talked about the culture. It's key not to move into too much of a domain where someone who needs to integrate something can't do it in the environment in which they're in because it's taboo and it's secret, because that ends up doing more damage than waiting a few years, even if it could have been beneficial in this and that area. But there's also, is there a connection? And we deal with things in splits in these areas where, for example, you have people's bodies saying, I want it, I want it, I want it, and their minds saying, I would never do that with someone like you. Well, you've obviously got a gap in integration there. You've got a gap in integrity. Or, I feel so great about you, but I don't want to touch you. Or, I think and feel like you're this amazing person. I just can't imagine my body. I can't touch you. Or I can touch you, but you're disgusting. You're dealing with the level of integration within the human being. It's nothing about the other person. If someone thinks you're disgusting, but they get all sexually excited, they have a challenge with their integrity. And there's nothing you can do to fix that until they fix the split, which often happens back in this template area. Now, the next thing that we come into is container. Now, what container is you have the container of culture, and culture protects you from the unknown, basically. We have a part of our brain that deals with new and interesting experience, and then we have another part of our brain that deals with it's always been that way, and we're going to do it because that's the way we've done it, and so this is a container. When you say, how are you, and you say you're fine even though you're not, you say, oh, I feel good, because that's normal. That's part of the cultural framework of predictable phenomena. So you've got a container of culture. But within the culture, then you have certain containers of relationship, and you have the personal container of the couple or the triad or whatever it is. So the container is very important to understand. Now, it's less important if you follow the cultural program, which is, in our most traditional sense, you stay a virgin, then you get married, you're blessed by your religion, whatever it is, and then you do whatever you want together within that container. You've got a somewhat clumsy container to bumble around in there and figure out what's going on. And you're not going to be shamed too much, within that framework. And so you don't have to be terribly conscious to kind of get into that container. But when you deal with things like an open relationship, which is culturally not sanctioned, and you deal with homosexuality, which part of the culture sanctions, part of the culture is cheering for, part of the culture hates, when you're dealing with this, it takes more skill because part of the culture is attacking you. Part of the status quo that part of you needs in order to feel safe and protect you from the unknown is attacking you. And some of that is internalized, so it takes more skill. Similarly with polyamory, and anything that breaks that cultural norm, you need to be more and more conscious and on the same page to create a personal container and protect that container. Otherwise, the fact that whatever is in there is being accelerated becomes problematic. Because, for example, if your insecurity is being accelerated and you don't have a container that can hold that level of insecurity, the relationship falls apart. Because the container is not there. In other words, the deeper the feelings, the deeper the ideals, the deeper the value, the stronger the container needs to be to hold the relationship together. Think of it like an electrical circuit. If you're running 20 million volts through a circuit, you've got to have very big wires, no resistances. You've got to have, careful engineering, or that thing is going to heat up and catch fire. Now, if you've got 2 volts throwing through it, you can have a short, and it's probably not going to burst into flames. 2 volts isn't enough to cause a huge problem. So if you have a very tepid relationship, you don't need much of a container because it's so tepid. There's nothing to hold. But if you've got a strongly intentional, dynamic flow on many dimensions, you need an incredibly crisp and carefully defined container to hold the energy. Now, this brings me into the, one of the kind of higher dimensions of sexuality, because it has a wide range of destructive and constructive possibilities. And whatever they are, they'll get louder and faster when sex comes along. Whenever you combine a polarity, a third energy is generated mathematically, emotionally, mentally. So there is a third energy. There is a synergy that is released when 2 polarities come together. And that synergy has a higher probability field than either of the 2 polarities on their own. You can think of it as a multiplication. 6 times 6, 36 is a bigger probability field than 6 or 6 plus 6. When you create an alchemy with sexuality that releases a third energy, and there is, of course, a science to that, when you create that alchemy, that probability field, the mass and weight of it, is bigger than either individual can create alone. And honoring that third energy, it's traditionally represented in a child. The child, scientifically, all things being equal, will have a higher probability field than either of the parents, all things being equal. Now, there's lots of dysfunctional ways where, a third energy can be created that's not a synergy at all, that it's a negative synergy, where the darkest parts of this parent and the darkest parts of that parent come together and then get disowned and passed on to the child, and the child truly embodies the worst shadow aspects that neither parents will own, and you have a negative synergy. But that negative synergy that is the combined shadow denied in both parents is more damaging as a probability field than either parent staying separate. So it's a big responsibility to give birth to a third energy. And what is necessary is a strong container to hold the integrity of that third energy. And because of its mathematical probability field, the third energy in a healthy relationship will transcend the personal egos. What I mean by that is the third energy having a higher mathematical probability field, 6 times 6, 36, way bigger. You've got an exponential synergistic effect as this third energy is given born, either in a deeper love than either person can create with self-love. So you have self-love, and you combine those two, and a deeper love for self and other will be born between two equal free people that come together in self-love and in respect. So because of that, it's like a company. If you say, okay, I've got $10 and I've got $10, and they're really important because, in chauvinism, it's all about money, right? So got to have our money, and I'm not going to, so got to hold on to our money. Okay, so you've got 10 and 10. Now, you combine as a kind of a negotiation on a mental level, okay, you got 20. But if you create a synergistic company together that gives birth to $100 out of the 10, the $10 that you invested is not what you want to protect. You want to protect the $100 that you co-created because it's a bigger field, because you can do more with that 100. And the more you can engage in that dynamic, the more powerfully you can interact. So for that reason, you protect the company's assets more than your $10. You protect the company more than nobody's going to tell me what to do and da-da-da-da-da. So you sublimate to the container once you've created it. It's no longer, well, oh, I know I created that container and, I said I wouldn't have sex and all that, but I feel like it. So I'm just going to blow the relationship. Any good relationship that is blown that way, you lose way more than the little self-centeredness your little ego gets in doing it. So it's not a good equation if you want to be rich. If you want to be rich in love, rich in engagement, and dynamic and energy, etc., you don't blow hundreds of dollars for your little $10. You think vision. And marriage has been the way that that's been communicated culturally before. You respect the marriage. You don't do this. You don't do this. As we throw that container away, we're not going to listen to the Pope and all that. We throw that away. A new sense of the mathematics and the grace and the science of container building and honoring needs to replace that, or we lose an exponential amount of our potential, power, and well-being. Now, you create a conscious culture with clear agreements. And by finding someone who understands that principle and is willing, because that's the other thing, you have a whole bunch of jaded subgroups in our culture who's been exploited by other idiots who didn't understand the container. And so we have a very much an attitude of, prove it to me and then maybe I'll show up. You dance and song around, seduce me, prove your worth to me, and maybe I'll show up. The only trouble is, to create that third energy, both people need to show up fully. You don't get to generate 1,000 watts of electricity by saying, okay, I'm not going to generate any power, just turn on 1,000 watts of electricity. Once I see 1,000 watts of electricity, then I'll contribute my voltage. No. You don't get to see 1,000 watts of electricity unless you contribute your full 500 watts. As soon as both people contribute their 500 watts, you have the 1,000 watts of light. It's like, okay, this is worth fighting for. But it's worth fighting for because you invested in it. It's not like it just appeared out of nowhere. And so you have a backwards and all kinds of misunderstandings about this. So that's part of this map, is massive cultural illiteracy, massive amounts of misunderstanding, and 90% of relationship potential being squandered and downtrodden and dragged through the mud because we don't bother to teach the science of relationship, the science of sexuality, the science of energy in school, in college, with our parents. We just don't bother. And so, not surprisingly, if you imagine how many 747s would take off and land successfully If nobody taught the pilot a goddamn thing or gave him a manual, well, we're in that kind of terrain with our relationships. Now, the next thing is to be aware of the mix. Sex is a mix of things. Now, one of the things is a chemical mix, and this ties in with the nature of sex that is an addiction, a pain management strategy, as all addictions are. And so, for example, sex is a high adrenaline, phenomena, particularly when it's a high risk phenomena. So you have this thing of, sex in a dark room. Am I going to get AIDS? Am I not? So it's high adrenaline, right? So you've got you've got the mix of chemicals that are going through your body and that you're seeking sex to generate. Because particularly on an addiction level, if you're a dopamine addict, if you're an adrenaline addict, whatever it is that you're looking for, you're going to try and create sex in the way that will stimulate that chemical, because you're not actually that interested in the other person. You're not that interested in the relationship or the third container. You're interested in your little hit. And so you may be with a perfectly loving partner, but it'd be interesting to go look through the neighbor's window or something. What are you seeking? Is dopamine, adrenaline? Is it what's the is it the rush of shame? All these chemical mixes, and this goes back to the sexual template. Now, the other part of the mix that is a very important variable in the sustainability of relationships is friendship versus lust. Now, this ties into the chemical mix, but it's best approached from the following question. In a good relationship, you are a friend of the other person. In a hot relationship, you're close to your sexual template, even if it's incredibly destructive. Now, there's a tension in any relationship at different times between what would I want for my best friend and what turns me on. What would I want for my best friend, my daughter, my sister, my mother, and what turns me on? Now, this is a tension primarily because a lot of our sexual templates are traumatic and abusive. So, obviously, if the highest rush of sex is going to be created by reenacting abuse. You have these phenomena where highly paid executives put on diapers and stuff. So they're reenacting, an abusive mother hitting them and all that, and terror of mom and all that, and guilt. And so they're reenacting that because that creates the most flow. But it's difficult to have the highest degree of respect and friendship. It goes back to the old split between the prostitute or the mistress and the mother. The mother should be the culturally sanctioned, prissy, wearing the right clothes, going to church on time, doing this, and this, and that. That's my wife, that's the mother. It's just that has nothing to do with the abuse template of growing up in this country. And so, it doesn't even turn me on. So if but I would never do those things to the mother, the wife, because there's a split. There's a cultural split that then migrates down to the individual, where now the individual is split. And the individual can't fully come together until the culture comes together. But the culture isn't coming together in part because of the phenomena of taboos. So it's, so you've got this constant pulling between, what would, and the reason that a prostitute facilitates flow is that the prostitute is lower in social ranking within the traditional culture. So there's this permission, like I've paid for it, and you're not that important anyways. Therefore, I can do these things that I would never do to a friend, and they turn me on, is kind of the dynamic. And I'll pay you a lot of money for occupying the role of this shitty, low-ranking taboo person who doesn't get to integrate in the culture. Because, we all need you, but we're going to throw you out and shame and scorn you, and, and then we're going to pay you a lot of money because otherwise who would play that role? I mean, why would you agree to say, okay, why should I be the one who gets thrown out and shamed and ignored, and not being able to talk and tell the truth and hold my head up in society? Why should I be that person just so that you can get off if you don't want to pay me a lot of money? I mean, give me a fucking break. So it's like, okay, you'll be a horrible person and we need you more than anyone. So we'll pay you a lot of money and then we'll shun you in public. And it's the split of the cult enacted on an individual level. And the thing about a long-term relationship is the friendship mix has to be higher than the lust mix, particularly when you have, a destructive sexual template, where what turns you on is ruining your life, or, doing high-risk activities that, get you sick, or whatever it is. You can't both be doing that to each other in a marriage. It's like, I'm going to throw you out the window. No, I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to strangle you. I'm going to shit on your face and give you the venereal disease. No, I'm going to do... you can't have a sustainable marriage born out of both people doing that. And so that's exported out into, the mistress, prostitute, concubine, whatever. And now that women have their own money and power, it goes, the other way. They have their, lovers as well. But for a long-term relationship to last, your friendship has to be at least 51% higher than your lust mix. In the mix, it's kind of like a fuel. You have a mixture of oxygen and gasoline going into the engine. You've got to have more friendship in the mix than lust. Otherwise, because that's what holds you in check from doing something destructive. Because your sexual template may say, oh, it'd be so exciting and hot to have you walk in while I'm fucking your best friend and you're screaming, and it would just really turn me on. So I'm going to do it. Well, that's the end of that marriage. It doesn't last. So you've got to be in a relationship where no matter what happens, you'll do what's best for your best friend with that person over what turns you on. So that's a very important mix. Now, it can't be too off, meaning you can't have, a great marriage where, it's 95% friend and, frankly, having sex could damage our friendship. So we're just not going to have sex. We're not going to risk it. I saw you sleeping there and I didn't want to disturb you, So, and then, I thought about that, but, you're busy writing your book. So we basically never have sex because we're so worried about each other's careers and this and that and the other. And so eventually you've got to have sex, elsewhere. But if the lust mix is higher, well, as you see, that doesn't end up anywhere. So the emotional mix is another thing. Do you have sex out of anger or out of sweetness or both? What's the emotional mix? And can you go full cycle within the relationship? Can you be feeling hurt and small and have sex? Can you be feeling angry and aggressive and have sex? Is there terrain that's taboo? And then where do those emotions get expressed if they're taboo within the relationship? And can they be talked about? Or can they only be acted out? No, I'm feeling positive and happy, honey. Can they be talked about, or are they only expressed physically? We both like the physicality of it and all that, but we would never think those thoughts because we're spiritual people. Now, you have the emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual mix. And this is also an important thing. And this ties somewhat into your paradigm. What's your paradigm within which the sex is occurring? That's part of your container. It's a very important thing. If sex is a spiritual healing process for you, that's a completely different paradigm than, well, we're bored, we'd like to get off, so let's fiddle around and see what's the best way to get off. And you're my person I'll go to when I want to get off. Okay, we agreed to be that role? Okay, you're the get off person. Okay, and you're the wife. And you're the exciting, romantic mistress person. And you're the friendship person who's nurturing, and you're the motherly, friendship person who's, I just feel warm and nurturing, and I can cry with you, and this and that and the other. And then you're this person who I have transcendent experiences with. So how much of that can happen within a given relationship? And how much of the psyche is served by that relationship? And how much of the psyche is suppressed to fit within the box or the paradigm? You have this phenomena where people who get off with one another, have, heaven forbid, one of them falls in love. And they say, do you mind if I fall in love? Get the fuck out of here. I don't want you to fall in love with me. You're my get-off person, and that doesn't turn me on. Get the fuck out of here. Now I need to get a new person to get off with because you've ruined it by falling in love. So the relationship, and you deal with the flexibility of the relationship. Can the relationship grow from the get-off person into the transcendent sacred experience? Or is it kept into this box where the first person who mentions anything, the first person who talks about a feeling, it's over, And so you have the mix of emotions. And it's very important to understand that in the cycle of life, that if anything is living, it's changing and moving. If anything is stuck, it is dying. So the more rigid your relationship, sexually or otherwise, the faster it will die. Because when you have a rigid mold, it means that for the person to move through the wheel of their own psyche, they are going to have to look elsewhere. They're going to, because you won't talk about spirituality, they're going to have a spiritual experience with someone else. And if you're too dumb to realize that, then the relationship needs to end so that you can wisen up and so that they can move on. And so we have also this phenomena of, do we move through and partner through the full terrain of the psyche, or, oh, I'm great with the career. I'll help you with your career. I'll give you hot sex, but nothing else. Well, as long as hot sex, and more importantly, the career in our culture, is what's being dealt with, that relationship will last. But as soon as it's like, yeah, my career is covered, and I'd like to learn more about myself. Well, don't leave me. Don't go there. I'll give you another tip on career. No, it's not you're gonna have to join me on the next step of my path, or I will find myself with someone else. Not because you're bad, but because you're stuck. And this process is, of course, not explored at all within the culture, which is why we have so many people confused. Why? Well, I thought this was fine. It was. It's perfectly fine. Until you wouldn't grow into the next part of the wheel. Until you wouldn't go beyond lightness and love into anger and pain. It's like, I'm the lightness and love person. We don't welcome anger and pain here. Oh, I guess my anger and pain is going to have to go and connect with somebody else. Because this world produces love and produces anger and pain in the thermometer reading of the human heart. In the color wheel of the human heart, you turn your attention over here, I feel pain. You turn your attention over here, I feel joy. I turn attention over here, I feel humiliated. I turn over here, I feel confused. And if you won't go with me into all of those feelings, I'm going to have to go into them alone or with somebody else. So we have life as a full spectrum of emotions, life as a full spectrum of ages, life as a full spectrum of paradigms, life as a full spectrum of emotions, life as a full spectrum of personas, and a full spectrum of intensities. And the most dynamic life opens to all of those and listens to something deep inside the self, to the soul, reaching for that. Well, how does that get to be enacted? If you've got a partner who's terrified of entering the corresponding area of their own psyche, of their own feelings. So they judge and attack you every time you go near it, because they don't know how to join you there. And you don't know how to teach them, because we're all in an emotionally and culturally and relationally illiterate culture. We haven't learned about the 10,000 cultures in human history. We haven't learned about the full wheel of emotions. We haven't learned about the full paradigm richness of our sexuality and relationships. And so, not surprisingly, we're scared of the unknown. And so we pull our partner back rather than inviting them forward. Now, trauma is a very important part of this domain, because trauma is an entire field of biology, relationship dynamics, and coping mechanisms. 1 in 7 Americans, for example, has a substance addictions. The majority of Americans are addicts to emotions and states and behaviors that help them feel safe in traumatic terrain. And we are a trauma illiterate culture. If you do not understand trauma, and it's going to take a good 30 hours to go into that domain, I recommend The Body Keeps the Score. You will not understand why your partner is attacking you or themselves in certain terrains that in the spiral and flow of the relationship take them into that region of the psyche where the repressed trauma resides. We go on to inner ages, and this ties right into trauma because much like a tree, when a pine tree grows, it's 1 year old and it has a single ring. And then it's 2 years old and it has 2 rings, and 3 years old. And, in our crude way of measuring the age of a tree, we chop it down and count how old it was before we cut it down. But every other ring is contained as a biological memory inside the tree. Now, our physiology contains the biological memory of every single past experience. Now, what happens with trauma in particularly is an experience comes up that's so overwhelming for the conscious mind to deal with, of a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 30-year-old, whatever. It just floods the system. At the same time, we get a message we need to act to survive because we're being shamed because our money is in jeopardy in a culture that devalues anyone who doesn't have money, or because this is an order. We need to act now, and there's an overwhelming emotional mental state that I don't know how to deal with. So what we do is we gather all that energy up, we dissociate it, we put a partition up that says, I'm now numb to that. Okay, now I've got the presence of mind to figure out what I have to do to respond. Now, these charges consume energy to maintain. First, they consume the energy of the trauma, and then secondly, you have to maintain energy constantly to maintain the partitions. So not surprisingly, once you've had a few thousand of those events go on in your life, you're exhausted because all that energy is out of circulation. It's not fueling mentally, emotionally, physically the system, number one. And number two, you're spending energy to keep it numb. That's too much energy. So I can't get out of bed. I can't get it up. And so you have the phenomena of chronic fatigue. You have exhaustion. You have disinterest. You have fear. Fear of reenacting trauma when there's been a lot of relationship trauma. When trauma has been the primary relationship template, then you don't really know how to get into a relationship with someone without being traumatized. And you have actual people who have sexual templates that unless you rape them, there's no way in. But if you rape them in just the right way, they'll respond to it. Now, that's obviously an impossible framework to get in, because if you don't rape them, they're not open. And if you do rape them, you're immediately in the terrain where you're the villain within the cult, because we don't have technology that would illuminate anyone about what's going on there. And so, basically, you have to stay away from a person with a rape template, a rape trauma template, where and you can find this where, eventually you have romantic relationships emerge out of BDSM parlors, for example, where you're the person who could rape me in the perfect way. So wonderful. And at least in that framework, you've got, a healthy connection point that doesn't make you a criminal. And that's very important, because we have this thing called consent. And it's also very important to understand that consent does not mean healthy. The fact that someone said that it was fine to do this means absolutely nothing other than that in their template, that's the way to survive. It could be horrifically traumatic to all aspects of their lives. That could lead to a suicide. But it's the only way that they know. So this is a big responsibility, and it should wake, one of the reasons I'm making this map is there's a shitload of stuff to learn about all of this. And no one ever came along and told me, hey, you have to learn about all this stuff, and here's where to go to learn about it. So I'm figuring it out. Now, and I've just talked to those women at those points and said, look, it seems like you're inviting me to violate you. Now, your words are saying you don't want to have sex here and all this. That's what I'm going to pay attention to. The fact that you're sticking your naked butt up against me and teasing me is what I'm not going to pay attention to. Because I don't want to play into this pattern where I'm the guy and yet another guy who doesn't listen. If you want sex, just ask for it. And let's talk about it, and let's create a safe container around it. If you want to stick your naked butt up against me and do this and that and the other, I'm just curious why you're doing it that way, and have you had other people before rape you in this situation? Well, your body's sending out that vibe. It's not good for me to go there. Yes, it would be adrenaline rich. And I would like to be closer, but not in that way. Can you come around? Can your conscious mind wrap around what you're doing and come in another way? And sometimes they get up and leave. So they're going to find someone who's going to rape them. And, and in our culture, the sledgehammer is going to come hard on the rapist. But it's not going to come down hard on the cult that we live in that insists on raising sexually and emotionally illiterate human beings and then throwing them together and then punishing them whenever they do it wrong, which is usually just means that that's what their parents did, which is often very wrong. It's just perfectly fine by our cult that that's what occurs. Now, what trauma creates is these energetic pockets at certain ages. Now, in the sexual experience, if it's safe and if it's open, you're going to find yourself back at those ages. You're going to find yourself terrified at 7 years old, or you're going to notice your partner is no longer an adult woman or an adult man. They're a 7-year-old little girl. Now, if they're a 7-year-old little girl in that moment, at some level, you have two options. You can reenact the abuse that was done, because a template is there, and that may be hot sex, but it will not release the pattern of blocked energy. You can go back and revisit and rape that 7-year-old multiple times, but eventually that dries up. And you can go find some other sexually abused person. There's an abundance of them in our culture to milk that energy out. And it can be consensual or not, all those different things. The real healing comes as you find those stuck points of energy and you learn to facilitate a traumatic healing, a release and reintegration of that energy back into the adult woman or into the adult man. And if you do that, More of their energy is available to you in the present. More of their energy is available to them in the present. They will trust you more, which means they'll lead you deeper into the trapped energy cycle. And there'll be another pocket. And again, the question will be, how do you relate to that trapped 2-year-old, that 5-year-old who's so desperate there, that 7-year-old, that 15-year-old who's very curious? How do you relate to that? And is that something you attune to? Do you have the kind of conversation like, gee, you seem like you're about 4 years old right now. How old do you feel? Do you have that conversation? Are you with someone in a paradigm? See, because in a paradigm of, oh, this is just fun fucking and all this, you can't go there. You may feel it, but you won't tell your partner. So you can't grow there. You can't bond in that level. You're having a secret relationship with a wounded part of self that you're excluding your partner from. Or you're maybe accessing it through alcohol or this or that or the other. But the reality is that we are always touching in at an emotional age predominantly, and it's changing constantly. And the more you are traumatized and disintegrated, the more volatile you'll be. 5 years old, then 30 years old, then 17-year-old and filled with anger, then 2-year-old and terrified, and 5-year-old and needy, and 7-year-old, don't hate me because I'm all over the board, and don't do this and don't do that, and it's up again. And the more volatile those changes and the less they're tracked, the more disintegrating the phenomena is. If you accelerate a volatile dynamic like that, you can drive someone crazy. You can go crazy because neither you nor your partner has created the container to hold that energy. And it's the most profound and high voltage energy you can imagine. You'll either use it to destroy your life or you'll use it to create a third alternative. And this is one of the fallouts from the free love movement. You had all that restriction, judgment, crystallized hostility and hatred and condemnation, and you're going to go to hell because you like sex. And you have all that crap that had to be blown off with the 60s. And now it's kind of deteriorated into, you take Kinsey's life, where he's explored all sexuality. You can watch the documentary about his life and all this stuff, but you watch how his sexuality deteriorated into pain with less and less container and into more and more destructiveness, accessing the charges and creating violation after violation after violation until too many things just splinter off and there's nothing holding it together. The more powerful the energy, the more critical it is to have a container. It's like a motor. You don't just set off explosions of gasoline. The more gasoline that is used, the thicker the steel needs to be used so that that is transformed into forward motion as opposed to just exploding and setting fire to things. Container is a critical technology and we don't have it. So the more we throw in promiscuous sex, the more we fuck around with that energy without honoring and containing it. It doesn't matter if you have 5 people in a relationship, if you have one person, if you have 2 women, if you have 2 men, it doesn't matter. You have to see, weigh, respect the charges and energy that is present and consciously build and honor a container. The container is what keeps that energy safe. In magical rituals, it's the circle. You don't just begin invoking magic, invoking the unconscious mind and all the different psychic energy before you draw the circle. The circle is what contains it. You open a ritual, you honor the ritual space, and you can close it. And in the dimension of sexuality, it is a ritual. And that becomes exponentially more important when you're dealing with it as a spiritual experience, as a sacred space, as an altered state phenomena. Now you go on to personas. You have a variety of sexual personas. I tried to write mine down once in my user's manual that I created to help, a partner or wife understand the map they were dealing with in this individual. But, you have distinct patterns of thought, feeling, and energy. And you can start by labeling them like the drunk persona, or the teenage me persona, or the I'm really infatuated persona, or I need to be loved desperately persona. Whatever it is, map out the different sexual parts of you that you've gotten to know. And what will tend to happen is different partners will invoke different parts of your psyche. And there will be a persona that when that persona is enveloped, you behave like this, you feel like this, you think like this, and you talk like this. You want to get to know those maps and, more importantly, the environments and the people who draw out which parts of you. Number one. Number two. Number three, you need to know which parts of those personas really bring the most value to you and to a relationship. And ideally, you find the partner and, more importantly, the container. And they fit together, meaning if you want a highly sacred spiritual relationship and you have a partner who wants a highly sacred and spiritual relationship, that partner is going to tend to want to write that stuff down and say, okay, let's have it like this. We'll do this kind of ritual and this, that, and the other. If you have someone, and that type of person who's drawn to that in themselves is likely to be someone that's going to help evoke that persona. And so you can just say, who wants to set up a sacred container in this way, in this way, in this way, and watch their body language, watch their words, watch if they light up, or watch if they're thinking, oh my God, what the fuck do I have to do to fuck this woman? What, circles and this? Oh my goodness. Okay, fine, we're going to draw a circle like this. Well, that short-term lust and variety seeking will wear off rapidly. But someone who really lights up and says, wow, amazing, I've done it like this, but I haven't done it like that, and this is incredible, and and wants to go like this, and wants to spend another few hours talking about this, and talking about feelings, and this and that, and they're becoming more energized as opposed to sleepy and depressed. Well, that's obviously a good match. Now again, this culture does not raise human beings capable of consciously navigating into a vast amount of our psychic terrain. This culture takes a good, 70 or more % of who we are as human beings and says that doesn't exist. If it does, it's not important, or it's uncool. You just take the cool phenomena. You have the cool sociopathic kind of polarity point, and you have the empathic and warm polarity point. Well, what are we all about? We're all about being cool, being less feminine, less emotional, more witty, more smart, more sociopathic, more sadistic. So, and you actually have, a lot of people being raised in that culture have a template. A lot of women, and it's an aggravation for warm, friendly guys, a lot of women will turn on by a smart, witty, sadistic, somewhat cruel and dominant male or woman who, just jabs at them in a way that reminds them of what it's like to come into the world as a woman and be rushed around rapidly and dissociated from their feminine parts. And so they'll turn on around that. It doesn't mean that's leading to a healthy relationship. It means there's a lot of charge around the pattern of the masculine violating the feminine, and a lot of emphasis on the sociopathic cool. Oh, that's so cool. I wish I could take all my warm, bubbly feelings that are so confused and I could just be cool and collected and just say it like that. That's so cool. Oh, I wish I could have less feelings, less femininity, and just be in control. And so you have this huge competition out of this where both men and women are aspiring to be as masculine as possible, as cool as possible, as sophisticated as possible, in control. And you have this I have parents in America always telling me, my daughter's a badass. She's not like those, poor feminine women who, have feelings and are artists. No, none of that. She's a badass. She's telling those men what to do. And that's the proudest American parental statement, that their daughter is not feminine. She's a badass. It goes back to that thing. When you have two people competing to be masculine, you've got zero flow. And you've just taken half of the whole probability field of the exponential synergy of the relationship and collapsed it. You can't get synergy unless one person is willing to do the highly politically incorrect, low social ranking, highly necessary thing of being profoundly feminine. And I know it's hard. I've been attacked for my feminine energy my entire life. That's why I go overseas, where people love when I play with children, love when I smile, love when I'm silly. And so I get to be a feminine human being overseas. And that does bring me to the next point, which is you need to find an environment in another individual or in another country where the parts of you that you want to elicit because they make you feel beautiful, they make you feel you, are coming to you in a reward ratio where you get rewarded for being the you that you want to be, and discouraged for being the you that you don't want to be, as opposed to being rewarded for being the part of you that doesn't feel good, and punished for being the part of you that you like. So, on that note, I would say the reason I'm talking to a camera rather than to a friend right now about this conversation is that this camera is more friendly to me in this terrain of nuanced mapping than any American that I know. So I'm talking to a camera. I've created an environment where this persona that I love this mapping persona. I've been looking for this map my whole life and it's like, okay, fine, I'll make it myself. And I love that. And yet it's not supported. I'd have to call 100 Americans before there was someone who said, oh, I'd love to hear about that right now. Let's do it. If I did, I'd be talking to people. Now, we come now to prostitution and freedom. And this is an important mix, and it could go down in the mixed category here. But prostitution and freedom is the level of need and for survival. Maslow has talked about the hierarchy of needs: survival, security, love, and belonging. Now, when someone does not have those three met, survival, security, love, and belonging, they have to please some other person to meet them. That's the way our world works. And particularly the individualistic world of the United States, individual being more masculine, the group being more feminine. So we are on the masculine pole again. So in that dynamic, the prostitute is the one that has to please, and there are mental prostitutes, feminine, emotional prostitutes. If you're trying to get hired, you go into the pleaser. Your boss says, what do you think about Japanese architecture? Oh, that's so interesting. I would love to hear about Japanese architecture. You go home, your kid says, I want to talk to you about Japanese architecture. It's like, shut up, I'm busy preparing for work. So when there is a lack of self-generated meeting of needs, you will be stronger in the prostitute mode to survive. Prostitution is a survival coping mechanism to please and need. And there's good and bad parts about this. For example, people have always been clumsy about relationships in our Western world. But, as long as we said women couldn't work and women couldn't be in the military, and they had to be nice and obey their men or they wouldn't get fed and get any money, it creates a prostitute dynamic where the woman must have the husband to survive and to look, because to be, a few hundred years ago, a woman is considered highly low status if she is not married. It's crap. So she's got So to meet her need for survival, security, love, and belonging, she's got to be married. So she's got to please a man enough to be married. She's got to be secure in her survival, which means she's got to, be useful around the house and all that. And, so you had that kind of clumsy facilitation by the religions of a sustainable relationship based on a certain amount of prostitution. But now that we have, freedom for both sexes, thank goodness, who's going to, so one of the things that we have going on is I'm not going to please you, and I'm not going to please you, and I'm not going to please you. And so you have a lot of lonely, isolated individuals. And yet you do need to please each other. I mean, the equation of a relationship says it takes 2 to say yes and 1 to say no. That's a fragile system. 2 to say yes, 1 to say no. That means both people in a free environment have got to please each other more than they would please themselves alone. Otherwise, there is no relationship. It's that simple. So the prostitution freedom dynamic also ties in with the inner maturity. The more we are dependent on another person for acceptance, for belonging, for am I a good person, the more we are in the younger ages. And we're induced into the younger ages by not having our own autonomy. It's one of the reasons that the healthiest relationships take place when you have both people can survive, are secure in their survival, and can meet needs for love and belonging independent of their partner. If you can have a relationship where both people are in that place, and every day is a free renewal of the commitment based on that potential of that third energy. Every day, I could meet my needs for belonging somewhere else, but I'd rather meet them with you. I could go out and have my own house, but I'd rather live with you. When you move towards freedom, you also move towards honesty. When you have a crappy relationship where, let's say, there's all kinds, it's usually traditionally the sugar daddy phenomena. So you have a crappy relationship. Well, what are you doing with that old geezer? Well, he takes good care of me. Well, those types of relationships are higher on the prostitution dynamic. And when the woman has equal money and stuff, they will usually break up, because what's keeping it together is, more of a I'll meet your needs, you meet my needs, because we can't meet them independently. This is not always bad. It's not a judgment one way or the other. You just can't release the full spectrum of the relationship until you're dealing with two adults. You cannot be a truly grounded adult when you depend on someone else for your sense of survival, security, love, and belonging. You are going to be, what do I have to do to please mom and dad? It's not bad. It's just not as high a ranking phenomena. And it's one of the reasons why in a power differential, because we can look up here, power to love balance, that ties into the mix of sex also. Is it about love or is it about power? And you look at some of the sex scandals today and like a Harvey Weinstein, and the comment over and over again, and you talk to his assistant, it wasn't about love or even sex addiction. It was about power. I wanted to dominate someone else, and I need to dominate someone else. So when sex is about power, of course, the person in the stronger position is not going to empower their partner, because as their partner has more and more power, there's less and less dominance. So a relationship that's moving towards love is a relationship that's moving towards freedom. In order for it to move towards freedom, you want to consciously and mutually take steps so that both people can meet their needs for survival, security of that survival, love and belonging outside of the relationship. That balances the power. When I can leave and grow my life and you can leave and grow your life, now we're together in a place of freedom, and it's freedom that leads to love. And so you can have a lot of sex around power differential, because that's a lot of what the childhood template is about. In a chauvinistic and abusive culture, the relationship between the innocence of the child, which is the feminine position, and the chauvinistic, materialistic dominance of the adult, which is the masculine position, is one of dominance. Shut the fuck up or you're not going to get to watch your TV game. Get out of my space. I need to do this here. I need you now. I'm feeling lonely. I'm going to hug you. Okay, I'm done with you. Go to sleep now. This is a relationship of dominance. And the child learns to please, to survive, feel secure in that survival, feel some sense of love and belonging. And to the degree that they please their parents, mentally, emotionally, sometimes sexually, they are meeting those needs. Now, then you take that into the adult, that will be the default dynamic. And sometimes what happens for men is they were in the pleasing dynamic with mom and dad, and then they're shamed as men for being feminine in a chauvinistic culture. And so they want to flip it, so now they're in the one in power. And so then they look for someone in the feminine position to be dominated, to regain the sense of helplessness that they had as children, being dominated by highly chauvinistic parents. So you have that prostitution freedom mix, with the healthiest love coming with both parties being free. And this can be engineered very consciously. I've spent most of my time with older women, usually not having more money, etc., than me, just because I haven't had that dynamic, except a few times. There was one millionaire that was very interested in getting married. But in that relationship, it's often been very equal. My wife started off in an unequal framework, being younger, having less money, having less social ranking and experience. And so the first thing to do was to discuss, and look at the danger of that and to see if it was truly beneficial. The second thing is to hold space that may end when the power differential catches up. But the biggest responsibility to have that move towards true love, as opposed to prostitution and, the child-parent dynamic, is, when I was, well, first of all, I left it somewhat in her court as to how much she wanted to pursue that. But when she's, said, okay, I really want, to have this relationship, I said, if this is what we've got fighting our health, and if we're going to be a couple, you need to be committing X number of hours every single day to grow your future into a place where it's equal or better than mine. Now, once you reach the freedom point where you could leave me and have your life improve, that's the point where, the deepest form of love will blossom, or the veil of need and prostitution will fall away. And I don't shame in any way prostitution. This is a survival mechanism. Men and women both do it with their bosses, all kinds of things. It's there with your boss. It's all over the place. So this is, our cult loves to shame prostitutes, etc. It's a joke. But this dynamic has to occur. And so, at that point, there will be less need, more independence. With more independence, more freedom, and more freedom, either more love will blossom, or that's the point when the relationship will end in a healthy way, because her unique individuality, masked somewhat by the power differential, which has been strong in her life, will fall away. And the greatest love that I can give to her is nurturing that independence up to that point where, she could make more money leaving the relationship, could do this, could be with a less picky guy. And so that's what we spend a third of our relationship time investing in, is rapidly growing her to that point. Because it's unhealthy. You can't have... And what I find is her love does blossom. Meaning I feel loved by her more than from many women. But it's in a context where, I think a lot of that love occurs naturally as we reach each milestone after another to a point where she no longer needs me in this area, in this area, in this area, in this area. And those are things that we celebrate, like, you don't need me anymore here. You don't need me anymore here. And you've got this as a backup plan. And, we set up, also an ending where anytime you want to end, you've got this option, or this option. And so that creates, some balancing of that dynamic. And so, that's just fine as long as you're aware, as long as you're conscious and responsible in that domain. So you come up to, the power and love dominant, balance. The inner relationship, and this is a very important thing to understand, is your romantic partnership, your primary relationship, whichever that is an externalization of your inner masculine-feminine dialogue. And this is why it's so transformative. It's almost impossible within our culture to become nuancedly responsible and responsive to the full inner dialogue of your inner personas. Half of them are invisible, others of them are taboo, others of them, why would you talk about that? There's a whole bunch of protections to make sure we don't get to know ourselves as human beings. Now, in for example, a relationship with my wife, she's in the feminine pole. I'm in the masculine pole. And so I get to learn how my masculine treats my feminine. And then I get to look at it and say, is that how I want my masculine to treat my feminine? Does that seem like a healthy relationship? And the easiest way to learn and fix that is to fix the way I treat her. That teaches me, because we're a chauvinistic culture, we're looking out. So I'm then looking out and I'm saying, okay, so I should be treating her like this, okay? And then I watch what happens inside of her as I make that shift. And when I see her glowing and luminous, I think, I've just learned how to treat my own feminine a little better. So shift again. And so that's a beautiful, awareness to have. And it's part of sexuality, because if you hate yourself, good luck growing your sexuality. And then finally, we come to transcendence. Sex, at its best, is an altered state experience. Why at its best? Well, the brain is... I'm going to just take a moment here. And see what happens when I plug this in. The brain has a reptilian brainstem, a limbic, emotional without thinking brain, a mix of thought and feeling, a dreaming future brain, and a transcendent brain. In order to access the transcendent brain, which is similar to the domains accessed through psychedelics and rituals. In order to access the transcendent brain, you have got to create a peace. You've got to create an environment in which the reptilian brain calms down because it feels safe. in which the limbic brain feels honest and held, and so it calms down. Because think of it like a jet of energy. The reptilian brain is 200 million years old. It's tough. Nothing gets through it unless it says, okay, it's safe. Then the energy can come up. Then your raw emotions, fear, anger, aggression, nothing gets through that unless they calm down, so it can go up. Then you have to deal with your thoughts. Is this a good idea? Is this a bad? Because we highly overdeveloped the left lineal brain, and so if your brain is chattering away, this is a bad person, you shouldn't be doing this, the energy doesn't get up through there. So for you to have, and then you've got to go into your dreams, like, oh, I can imagine this future with this person, or my future, or this. And so you don't get to transcendence until the energy penetrates all the way up through all those barricades, which you don't even know about because we're culturally, emotionally, relationally illiterate. So it gets up there, and you go beyond the ego. You go beyond the self. You touch a part of a larger body of which you are a small particle, and you transcend the primary identity of I'm me, separate from everyone else, and you become one with something bigger than yourself. And this is the most powerful kind of sex, because this is externalizing the inner relationship to the partner, and then externalizing the partner relationship with the totality of time, space, and the multiverse. It doesn't get bigger than sex on that level. When you externalize the entire complexity of this relationship with the multiverse, with all possibility, and you feel yourself a part of that, simultaneously one and part of something bigger, you release a probability field that is 1,000, 1,000,000 times bigger than anything that you could deal with on an individual level. And of course, there's a wide degree of range in that, intensity, presence for that. There's a wide degree of integrity. We have a skeptical Western brain, carefully curated by our materialist scientists, that are busy telling us that the most grand and transcendent human experience we could possibly imagine probably doesn't exist, and if it does, is not welcome in polite society. So we've got all that stupidity pounding down on us. So we may have our brain against us. We may have our feelings. What the fuck is going on? You may have trauma. Well, this is unknown. I've not done this before. And still, a little bit of that energy comes up. It's the biggest experience we've ever had in our lives. And we have to figure out what to do with it in an emotionally fucked up, trauma-illiterate culture, in which trauma is the negative form of transcendence, the moving into the beyond ego space from a fear of death. This is moving into the beyond ego state from an incredible awareness of life. It's the pinnacle where if you learn to love another human being with excellence, with mastery, with integrity, if you learn to heal trauma, if you learn to balance the masculine and the feminine inside and in the partner relationship, if you learn to move through dependency and imbalance to move into a place of freely loving, that you can slowly touch that little bit of an edge, that joy, that radiance. Now, we have not begun to touch that as a species. We have not begun to touch it as a country. We have not begun to touch it as a community. And most of us have never got anywhere near it in our personal relationships with ourselves and each other. But you do have that doorway that is possible through sex.